Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. And today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Brian Wong, all the way from Hong Kong. So Brian is a political strategist and he's the co-founder and director of Oxford Political Review. And he comes from a very interesting background. So Brian, welcome today. And how are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing as well as one could possibly be on 2 hours of sleep, which is quite well, actually. I must say caffeine does have its utility, and I strongly recommend caffeine being recognized as a strategic resource and also rare earth mineral. So that was a joke. Anyway, caffeine is not a mineral, to be very clear. It's a form of, it's a nutrient. In fact, it's a chemical, but I digress.
Yes. So great, and actually we appreciate it, Brian. You're on a very busy schedule and you're walking and you're doing the podcast with us. So thank you very much for that. So let's start with our first question. What is meant by geopolitics?
That's a great question. And I want to just start by noting that there's no fixed definition to geopolitics per se. Mm-hmm. As with a lot of terms we often use in contemporary discourse, right? For instance, freedom or democracy or governance or even indeed nation and nation state. There's no fixed, singular definition that ought to undergird the way we interact with these terms, which means that a corollary here is that in many of these contexts that we speak of, the terms that we're using are necessarily indicative and reflective of the biases and presuppositions and also the political and philosophical methodologies that we espouse as individual agents. And it's important on my part to clarify that as a precursor, right? Because otherwise, I'd assume I'd be imposing my doctrinal understanding of geopolitics in a manner that's disingenuous, because it's not the only means of understanding geopolitics. With all that said, okay, no more rambling on that end. What I would see, personally, geopolitics could be defined as is essentially the intersection between geographical, and by that I mean climate, meteorological, and also geological factors, including resources and access to resources, the intersection of the geographical with the international, e.g. interstate, and also multi-state competition, interactions, rivalries, and so forth, and the intersection between those two forces and the political, okay? The political being the distribution and allocation of power, of claims and rights to govern, of purported and actual legitimacy. So geopolitics is best understood by the formula, if you will, of geography times politics times, in brackets, the international, okay? So geopolitics is essentially the amalgamation, but also the sublimal intersection of these three disparate forces. So that's geopolitics in the broadest sense possible. What do we mean by geopolitics in specific contextual senses, though, right? Because, Liz Truss talks about the return of geoeconomics in the speech that she gave at Chatham House when she was still a foreign secretary in the UK. And then you also had, all of this chat about geopolitical risk analysts, people claiming to know and be able to predict and forecast what's happening, purportedly with a crystal ball. I don't have any crystal balls, although I do certainly have crystal glasses. No, not really, actually. Now, what I would say is geopolitics in a narrow sense should be conceptualized as tensions and conflicts between countries that are motivated and driven by geopolitics in a grander and broader sense, okay? So it is the conflictual, the agonistic, the combative and the bellicose. That's what ultimately narrow geopolitics is defined by. So when we say we're now living in an era where geopolitical fragmentation and geopolitical contestation matters, what we're really saying here is that this is geopolitics in a narrow sense of the word, okay? And that's also why I'm skeptical of those who say, oh, geopolitics is now back. Mate, it's always been there. It's just that your kind of geopolitics, our understanding of geopolitics, can no longer be seen as just a sort of status quo preserving, stability-oriented paradigm. And instead, it's high time that we once again, as a global north, engage and took seriously the possibility of conflict, whether it be a war in Ukraine by the invasion of Russia, of an independent sovereign state, or alternatively, contestations and rivalry between China and America as both of them wrestle for great power status. And finally, of course, the fragmentation and recombination of alliances and regional bodies like the EU and ASEAN, which are all indications and also indicative demonstrations, really, of geopolitics at large. So that's my answer to your first question. I hope I wasn't too long-winded. If I am, you can tell me. If I'm not, you can also tell me. So feedback is always welcome.
That is a superb explanation. I'm sure even a young teenager would have understood what you articulated very well. So
that's wonderful. I've often been told that what I say is not to be taken lightly by teenagers. And then to which I say, well, at the very least, would you rather as a parent that your child listen to me or TikTok? Because I can promise you one thing. I don't make that many promises, but I never use TikTok. So all of my content you can only access in textual form. None of that sort of a nonsensical TikTok balderdash, which some folks seem to enjoy delighting in. I don't oppose TikTok for geopolitical reasons. I oppose it because of its pure banality and inanity. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So what are the factors actually affecting geopolitics? And let's look at some example and how it affects the economy.
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I think there are broadly 4 to 5 forces, okay, in which geopolitics exerts active influence on the economics. I'm just going to go through them one by one. I'm not going to signpost them. I'm going to start first with supply chain and the question of supply chains. Now, hands up. I know this is a podcast, but hands up, you've heard of the term nearshoring. And hands up, you've heard of the term friendshoring. And above all, you know, all of these chats about basically securitization of supply chains, The reality is these terms and their increasing ubiquity and frequency in our common everyday parlance is reflective of a broader trend. And that is that increasingly trade cannot be detached from geopolitics and also questions of national security and political interests. Historically speaking, especially during the golden ages of globalization, we saw barriers to trade lowered between countries with competing governing systems, or rather conflictual and even antagonistic governing ideologies, as well as clearly incompatible institutional arrangements. Globalization brought autocracies into the fold of democracies and vice versa. It also enabled the global north to pillage and to expropriate, to exploit in a resource, but also manpower and human capital sense, the global south. And above all, globalization almost succeeded in convincing all of us that we could live in a world, as John Lennon once hypothesized. Imagine a world where there are no borders, where there are no countries, we're just one people living under, you know, a common flag, banner, whatever, you know, what will you? And, you know, globalization, I'd say, and according to many, right, reached its peak in the immediate run-up to the 2008 global financial crisis, in globalization. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. And all of that, just to tie back to the because I realize I'm veering slightly off track here, but it's useful background information. All of that is to say that we're now living in a time, for the first time in 40 to 50 years, where countries are seeing supply chains logics, okay, and the routing and the direction and the sort of overarching arrangements of supply chains no longer through merely the lenses of reducing costs and maximizing profitability, okay? This is no longer an era where supply chains are just governed by the pure economic and rationalist logic of cost and benefit on an individualist or on a collectivist / firm-based level. For the first time in 50 years, especially in light of the end of the Cold War, countries are now thinking about, you know, national security. Think about whether or not they have access and ownership over vital strategic materials like rare earth minerals, which I joked about earlier on when talking about caffeine. And above all, countries are also wary that what if core and vital aspects of their own supply chains were to fall into the hands of geopolitically antagonistic actors that might either subtly and implicitly leverage these to score their own individual political gains, or alternatively boycott and just block out, right, and take out core chunks of supply chains. So one way or the other, what we're seeing here is a shift away from pure cost and benefit rationale and calculus towards a more subtle, still rationally governed at large, but not cost minimizing and not economically rational, specifically in a narrow sense of the word, approach, where supply chain partners are not just chosen on who makes the cheapest, you know, chips, who makes the cheapest solar panels, okay, or who produces the cheapest oil and food, but instead if these countries are ideologically and geopolitically aligned with oneself, and the emphasis being on geopolitical in particular, because a lot of folks in the so-called Western alliance, they're not democracies, and yet the West would embrace them. I'm not going to name names here, but I'm sure you can tell me one or two examples on your end as well, right? About a certain country that's governed by effectively a religiously indoctrinated and also doctrinaire majoritarian sect that has adopted pretty dodgy policies in response to Muslim minorities in the country. I wonder what that country might be. And that Muslim minority, in terms of numbers, right, there are over 200 million Muslim minorities in that particular country. So they're not really a minority either, in an absolute sense of the word. But what I'm trying to suggest here is geopolitical considerations have rendered supply chain logic and allocation no longer merely one that is streamlined and driven by streamlined cost-benefit calculus. That's point number one. Okay, we've got 4 more points to go through, so just bear with me. Got lots to talk about. Second dimension of geopolitical infiltration, though, is on essentially the weaponization of finance. The finance, it's like the mana. It's like the energy fuel that runs through us, like the blood, okay, that runs through our veins and veins of countries. Finance can drive progress, drive innovation, and above all, it serves 3 critical functions, as we all know: storage of value, a facilitator of transaction, and a unit of accounting. Okay? And yet increasingly, this ostensibly and in many ways actually end neutral purpose, right, and manifestation of finance has been contaminated, has been attenuated, and transformed into weapons. Weaponization case example 1, the employment of sanctions and counter-sanctions by leading powers in the world to score their own private, or ideologically predisposed ends of punishing or embracing, of recognizing or acknowledging, or alternatively demeaning and denigrating politicians and political leaders. Case in point number 2, the usage of sanctions against entire countries, removal of a certain country, right, which is admittedly on a collective level performed incredibly egregious, morally dubious things, but the removal of Russia from SWIFT, right, is indicative again of an attempt to weaponize finance and to signal to them, or signal to Russia rather, that the behaviors that is enacted on a collective level are not to be tolerated per, the international order in the eyes of the West, right? Where not that is normatively justified is a separate question, but it is clear that there's a weaponization in the form of basically knocking folks out of the primary tools of transaction. In Russia's case, they can resort to the CIPS, which is a China-led financial order as an alternative. But in other countries' case, they may not be as lucky or fortuitous, so to speak. And who suffers the most? It is not the political leaders, the selfish and the ulteriorly motivated imperialists that launch this conquest. It is not them who suffer the most. It is ordinary civilians. It is the people on the ground. It is the middle classes and no middle classes whose work fuels and funds the government. So I would note here that weaponization of finance has broader spillover implications we can talk about in terms of internationalization of alternative currencies, de-dollarization when it comes to the main reserve currency of the world, right? The rise of crypto, and also, admittedly, I'm somewhat skeptical, but don't tell people I said that. The rise of crypto as a possible alternative to central bank digital currencies. These are all secondary effects and implications of this second transformative force of the geopoliticization of finance. Okay, let's talk about the third force, right? We've got finance, we've got supply chain so far. What about the third thing? Well, the third force is to think about the climate transition. Okay, so let's say we're trying to produce the largest number of solar panels, generate the best forms of renewable and clean energies. Okay, all of these are noble and reasonable objectives. So logically speaking, if this is a sort of uni goal, or the exclusive goal that we have, right, as a collective people in the species, then logically we should allocate our resources in a manner that optimizes for that end objective, which is that we produce the largest number of clean energy, ensure the most equitable distribution of green energy, right? You'd agree, and also, of course, reduce the cost of transitioning towards, solar energy, wind energy, nuclear energy, so on and so forth. So if there were only one metric and objective we had in mind, it's pretty simple: optimization or minimization problem. Kumbaya. That is not how the world works today. And why? Why is that? Why do you think we're not optimizing for the cost efficiency of the green transition as the sole proprietary objective that ought to matter and determine really, or you'd think really, the climate or climate-related green technologies that we have? Why? The answer is simple. This is a rhetorical question. Sorry, just to be clear, a rhetorical question. And the answer is because countries no longer trust one another when it comes to being willing to and capable of and also open to sharing such instrumentally vital and essential resources. Countries don't have the faith and are not willing to. I paraphrase here, by the way, a friend of mine from the States, they're unwilling to think or to accept that, parts of this essential circuit could be produced in countries with whom they do not share values and can't see eye to eye. They don't want to see that happen. And especially when certain countries have made the green transition and renewable industries vital pillars of their own economic growth, then those countries that are opposed to and wary of their economic rise and astronomical ascent would naturally take issue with supporting and enabling that green ecosystem and supply chain building coming from that particular country. I'm not going to name names here. We all know who we're talking about and what we're talking about, right? And therefore, despite the overarching goodness of adapting to climate change, right? Identifying nascent technologies enables to cope with the effects of climate change, geopolitics has once again entered into the room. And it's done so by thwarting international and multilateral collaboration. It's done so by causing the ossified balkanization, the fragmentation of the renewable energy industry and sector and the supply chain at large across the world. And that to me is the third manifestation of the geopoliticization of climate economics and climate economy. Fourth, and this also, by the way, has a similar underlying structure somewhat as the climate change argument, but this is different insofar as the subject of contention isn't so much renewable energy as people. Economics, especially in the Ricardian sort of liberal, liberated sense, often emphasizes that talents chase the money and markets chase the talents, right? Talents are important. Freedom of movement of labor, freedom of movement of people and workers. This is pivotal to ensuring Pareto efficiency. And whilst we've always accepted that there are going to be limits to freedom of movement, right? With borders, with migration managed and curtailed and curbed by countries that are wary of their national identities being diluted and also attenuated by outsiders and incumbents. These are all long-standing concerns and considerations, but, and this is a big but, with the advent of the following three forces under geopolitics, we're seeing a radical shift and overhaul to the broadly pro-immigration consensus that have been cultivated in the aftermath of World War II, or rather the Cold War in a global north. What are these three forces? First, the rise of identity politics by politicians that are trying to stoke fears and weaponize opportunistically the rise of immigration and also the fear of the political other as a means of creating cleavages and voter bases that would loyally subscribe to them and back them. And that, you see that with regards to Le Pen in France saying, we don't welcome Muslims, according to her in France, or Donald Trump saying, we don't like those Mexican migrants from the South. That's what Donald Trump would say, right? To alienate again, to castigate an entire people from the Hispanic world. Or even more closer to home, you can see that with regards to the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric between India and Pakistan, or the Rohingya people, in Myanmar. These are all forms of subjugation and oppression that are being rationalized and legitimated through identity politics. And why is that important? Because that means that there's, for the first time perhaps in a few decades' time, genuine wariness and skepticism towards having open borders, or more open borders rather, and free-ish immigration to and fro and within countries. There's a genuine sense of repudiation of that logic. And the second force there is also the securitization of migration. Historically, whether or not you move to a certain place or not, it's your choice. It's a matter of the economic strength and endurability of the places you move to, sure. But by and large, this is an individual decision, right? I move here, I don't move here. It's not up to my government to decide. And yet, whether it be, as epitomized by Trump's erecting the wall, which failed, by the way, and keeping out migrants, or the deployment of atrocious, callous ICE officials to uphold so-called immigration status laws in America, or more closer to home, how refugees are treated in the Mediterranean Europe, per se, refugees from Syria, from Libya, so on and so forth. There's a greater and increasing sense of securitization of the discourse about migrants, right? That, okay, what really matters when it comes to migrants is security. We don't want, purportedly criminal elements. And that becomes an adage, and an adage that is then spun into a mythologized, stylized fact to justify, again, hostile anti-immigration policies. So all of this is to say that I think the second force we need to be wary about and concerned about is the encroachment and onslaught of national security related rhetoric that almost exclusively frames migration questions as around safety. And then there's a hyperbolization of the dangers of unbridled immigration, an exaggeration of the perverseness of it all, and of course a systemic downplaying of the benefits that are associated with migration. And all of these discourses in turn contribute towards a dangerous level of paranoia and also reactionary vindictiveness, okay? And that ties me on to the third force under this point. The so-called fears of espionage and intelligence and infiltration, allegations of fifth columnists. Just look at how ethnic Chinese folks are being profiled in America, but also how Americans and Westerners are being profiled in countries that are hostile to the West or antagonistic to the West. It cuts both ways. But the upshot there is that increasingly individuals are held hostage by not just their own governments through the expectations of, their compliance and being compliant with the demands, but they are also being held hostage by the governments of foreign nations that treat them with suspicion, with structured and structurally inculcated, otherization, that almost constantly and perennially questions them for their so-called loyalty. And it is that claim that loyalty must be affiliated or correlated with one's ethnic identity. That claim, and it's raising over its past 20 years, has contributed towards the rearing of heads of very pernicious forces. Pernicious forces like racial profiling, stop and frisk, but also targeted granting and revoking of visas. So all three forces I highlighted just then have in turn fostered basically a weaponization of migration and a weaponization of the flows of labor and talents, and really just the deneutering or the deneutralization of migration policy and a rendering of it into basically subservient to geopolitical goals and also wider objectives concerning policing ideologies and beliefs within the borders of countries. So that's, I believe, the fourth point I wanted to raise. I've basically plowed through 4 points, right? And I've yet to cover my fifth point, okay? So let me move on to my fifth point now. And this is the final point before I hand the floor back over to you.
Sure.
When we think about geopolitics and economics, the two don't go naturally. They don't go well with one another. Like if you ask companies 10 years ago if they had invested into geopolitical consultancy and thinking through the implications of politics and international relations, most of them would probably scoff at you and say, why would we need that? We don't need that. We don't need politics. We're here to make money. But yet if you'd done the same sort of demographic survey, say last year or this year, and I speak from first-hand experience, many corporations are saying, look, mate, we need someone who understands, the tenets and the doctrines of this particular regime. I want to know if there's going to be war breaking out over Kashmir and what's going to happen in sort of the LAC, the line of actual control. What exactly does delimitation mean for, Tamil minorities in India and Tamil Nadu, right? And is Sri Lanka going to see a resolution of its debt crisis, or is the ongoing stalemate only going to drag out? I mean, luckily we saw the IMF deal go through thanks to, the eventual at the 11th hour pulling through of a number of parties that were originally quite reticent to support the post-Rajapaksa government, right? And obviously, I can see the Sri Lankan case and the source of grievances and frustrations, but I can also understand why there's increasing geopoliticization of issues as trivial and banal and as technical as indeed the debt reform package. What does this mean? The fifth point I want to make here is that there's a mindset and paradigm shift. No longer can economics and politics and geopolitics be taken as different sides of different coins. No longer are they separate streams that can in fact be compartmentalized and broken off into silos. We live in an era where all of these forces come together And it behooves us as individuals trying to make sense of the world at large to highlight and to track how these forces come together. Okay?
Yeah.
So these are the 5 points I wanted to make just then to answer your question. And again, thank you very much for that super interesting question. I
Sure.
just, thank you. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. And Brian, just I have another question also. We noticed that the Chinese currency is becoming strong. I heard that they're going to trade with Brazil also in Chinese currency, as well as in Russia, where the US dollar will become a bit weaker in those two countries. What are your views on that?
Depends what you mean by stronger, because if you mean it by appreciation of the currency, that's not happening anytime soon. Don't think RMB is going to appreciate, given all the benefits associated with not letting it appreciate. Cough, cough. But look, I guess what you're asking me really is RMB going to see an increase in percentage and also concentration of proportion, right? In terms of the international basket of drawing currencies or the currencies in the draw. And my honest answer is yes. De-dollarization and the rise of the yuan will happen. But two caveats, right? The first is we can't be too deterministic. And secondly, let's not kid ourselves into thinking that it's going to occur at a magnitude and scale that's often been hypothesized and touted by propaganda, right? Propagandistic sources want us to believe that RMB's internationalization is all but inevitable and is going to supplant as a currency the USD in no time. But in practice, if we are to take things seriously on a more realistic level, I'd be deeply, deeply wary of drawing such conclusions. So let me just start by making a positive case as to why I think that there are indeed structural forces favoring de-dollarization and rise of RMB. And then I'll explain why, with that said, there are caveats and clear limitations to the scale and also to the extent to which that's going to come through and succeed. Three reasons why it's going to occur. The first is, of course, weaponization of finance has gotten a lot of countries wary, right, about the West. Weaponization of finance by the West, specifically the US, has gotten a lot of countries thinking about, if I want to be doing transactions over things like oil sales, food, crops, commodities, essential, I can't afford to have basically my whole country's food supply and energy supply contingent upon basically a currency that I'd be banned and prohibited from utilizing. Okay? And secondly, if indeed my usage of such currencies grants a certain country indirect leverage, I must start thinking, do I really want to grant them that leverage and accord them with such privilege? Probably not. Okay? Or perhaps not. But a second force too is it's about the symbolism of having unions and alliances, right? Not just the practical utility, but the symbolism of having unions adopting alternative currencies. BRICS, for instance. Look at Russia, Brazil, China. They're now all using RMB, okay, to conduct transactions amongst them in oil and energy and so on and so forth. Not South Africa per se, and not India per se, but the other three countries. Let's not forget that Brazil, China, and Russia add up to a pretty sizable chunk of the world's population as well. Last I checked, I believe that's roughly 20%, if not 30% or 25% of the world's population. You can do the maths. Apologies, I'm not a mathematician. But all of this does prove one point, that we are seeing greater geopolitical and strategic incentive to move towards alternatives to the US dollar. And thirdly and finally, the recent banking crises reflect, or rather indicate, a larger problem that underlie the American banking system, which is essentially this perennial failure to ensure that they can meet stress tests and requirements concerning reserves, right? Unlike the Chinese reserve requirement ratio, which is quite stringently enforced, say you subscribe to and believe in Chinese, reported numbers at least, they are quite stringently enforced. In contrast to that, Basel and the intricacies and implications of Basel have never been fully followed through when it comes to the robustness of the financial system of America and the West at large. So what does that mean? That means if I was someone putting my money and depositing my money with the SVB, for instance, right, I'd probably be pretty flustered right now because yes, the Fed did say they would, make good 90% of the deposits or 95 or something. But what about the remainder? And what about the possibility of another bank failing, right? Signature Bank, haha. It just happened, Credit Suisse. So all of these are examples of Western financial institutions that have come under a lot of strain over recent months and years. And whilst they're not directly related to the currency adopted and denominated, for these institutions, it's not to do, of course, we're not to use RMB or USD, but it's a broader sense of confidence. Will US assets be the sole assets to which folks turn for risk-averse investments and to preserve value going forward? Currently, yes, right? They are the sort of the risk-free assets, okay? But at what point will people say, no, there are other risk-free assets I'm going to invest in? Because that's when those who subscribe to USD as the primary currency would have to start worrying about the status of their investment and also currency backing. So all of these are reasons as to why I do think that de-dollarization is going to be a trend, and a rise of RMB as a likely alternative is, not impossible. But, and here are big buts. One, if RMB is to genuinely become a globally transactional currency, it needs to fix its problem of capital controls to ensure that either you have a large enough offshore supply of RMB, or that there's only one supply of RMB that's tied to the real state of the Chinese economy. Because short of that, you're not going to see folks wanting to buy into it, especially from non-Western nations, to have a choice and have an alternative in determining the currency you use to transact. Secondly, China needs a robust rule of law and globally recognized legal jurisdiction that allows them to convince folks, including those from, say, non-aligned countries or potentially even antagonistic countries at parts, that China is here to do serious business and that the RMB is indeed something in which they can comfortably transact in safely, securely, and with no repercussions. Thirdly, to do that, Hong Kong must also step up and become not just an international financial center for China, but an international RMB center for the world at large. Can Hong Kong do that? Can Hong Kong succeed? I hope it can, but there are lots of ifs and lots of buts. And fourthly, and this is last and arguably the most important point, let's not forget that de-dollarization doesn't mean that people have to turn to the RMB. They can also go to the euro, okay?
Okay.
Or the Japanese yen, right? Especially, although I don't think this is likely now, given the latest news about the incoming governor. But if Japan starts adopting a more, aggressively dovish and pro-expansionist monetary policy, that could well strengthen the yen. So all of these are forces that I think are germane in determining a balance of monetary and financial powers. And it's not as simple as saying, oh, the Chinese RMB is on the rise and the rest are bound to fall. No, I don't think so. It's not that simple. You've got to be wary of drawing hasty generalizations that are rooted in little more than just unrequited, unilateralist, Pollyannish thinking. There we go.
Yeah. Wow. So excellent explanations, Brian. So thank you very much for that. And do you have any final message to all our viewers? Any motivational message?
Yes, I do have one very clear message. The era of geopolitics, my friends, is before us. And we have two choices. We can take the blue pill or take the red pill. The blue pill allows us to pretend that globalization is going to continue in a way it had in a sort of, miraculous era and the epoch of grandeur and beauty that we saw in the 30 years after Cold War's ending. Taking a blue pill allows us to live our lives simply, happily, almost as if nothing's happened. But if we were to take the red pill instead, I also have a fear, because I'm not a sort of pure red pill advocate either. There's too many folks taking a red pill because of the drastic nature of the transitions here, go too far. They swing too far in the opposite end. They start calling for securitization of everything, okay? Building up your supply chains resilience, democracy versus autocracy, all of these nice value-based frames that frankly sound strange-lovian if you take a step back. But those who subscribe to the red pill philosophy would say, yeah, let's go to war. Let's go to war over what? No answer. Let's go to war for what? No answer. When do we go to war? No answer. Why is it justified to weaponize and instrumentalize individuals' lives to go to war? No answer. So what I propose instead is, between these two choices, we need to create a third option, the purple pill. We need to have a healthy adherence to the liberal internationalist ideals that have in many ways supported us for so long, but also a cognizance of the realistic constraints and the bottlenecks that render such ideals optimization and actualization not always feasible. And it is through navigating the quagmire and also the interactions between the ideal and the non-ideal, the realistic and the unrealistic, and ultimately to be idealistic in our aspirations, but also realistic in our pursuit of implementation. That is how we shall safeguard ourselves against the risk and also obtain and discharge the Herculean task of surviving in an era of returning geopolitics. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the explanations.
Thank you very much. That was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.